Hey guys, tonight we drift into the dim glow of oil lamps glistening off wet clay. You're walking barefoot along a winding alley of mud brick houses in a Sumerian city that hasn't yet learned the word ancient. The walls around you radiate the day's heat, but are slowly cooling under the desert night. Stars above flicker like forgotten gods, and you wonder which one watches over the beer rations stacked in nearby storerooms. This is the world of clay tablets and scribes, where receipts are literally pressed into earth. You probably won't survive this. 4,000 years back, the city smells of dung-fueled hearths and fermented barley, and everyone's got their own ideas about who rules the sky. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Post your location and your local time in the comments. I love seeing where you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the packed earth courtyard, where scribes huddle over tablets. Their styluses look like little popsicle sticks carved to a point, pressing into damp clay with a rhythm almost like raindrops. This first big fact. Mud brick houses here aren't just for living. They're also informal archives. Families wedge spare clay tablets into gaps between bricks, trusting the desert air to bake them solid. Quirky tidbit. Sometimes tablets about the beer rations double as math homework for scribes, with the little doodles of goats in the margins. Historians still argue whether these drawings were playful distractions or hidden bookkeeping codes. You edge past a storeroom where amphorae of beer sit capped with reed stoppers. Warm air wafts the scent of barley and date syrup. A guard, half asleep, mutters about missing jars while scratching his beard with a bronze dagger. Your sandals crunch on broken potsherds, like walking on ancient cornflakes. The moonlight pools in narrow alleys, making puddles of silver. You notice every door is painted with simple symbols: fish, reeds, stars, because addresses don't exist yet. When someone owes beer, a runner carries a clay tablet with their name, well, more like a mark, and a tally. These little rectangles are IOUS that feel heavier than gold. In the flicker of a torch, you catch the stylus grooves of one such tablet, a list of rations to workers digging a canal nearby. The governor apparently promised extra beer if they finish before flood season. A dog trots past carrying a leftover bread crust. Somewhere, a child recites multiplication tables. 3 jugs times 4 workers. Sleepy arithmetic wrapped around real hunger. Your shadow elongates across the mud as a breeze stirs from the river, carrying cool dampness and the distant sound of a reed flute. You slip into a courtyard where women knead clay tablets like bread, smoothing edges before the scribes press symbols. The scent of wet earth and barley mixes with sweat. Someone cracks a joke about how even the gods must file receipts. A donkey brays, echoing off the ziggurat's massive steps. The ziggurat itself looms like a layered wedding cake of mud and brick, each level holding storerooms and shrines, all of it glowing faintly in the moonlight. You're feeling a little lightheaded from the warm air and the steady chant of a priest nearby. He's sprinkling beer on the ground as an offering. Quirky fact, too. Some priests wore special headdresses with embedded clay tablets showing their rank, like the world's first business cards, but heavier. Historians still argue whether that was ceremonial or purely administrative. You step around a drainage channel trickling with dark water. The coolness of the clay under your fingertips makes you realize how alive this city is, even in its sleep. The scent of incense drifts from an open doorway. Inside, scribes slump over their work, styluses still clutched, tablets drying in neat rows on wooden racks. You imagine them as the first night shift accountants, their handwriting baked into immortality. As you continue, the alley opens into a small square where a low fire flickers. A storyteller recounts myths of a goddess who brewed the first beer for the gods themselves, and how mortals learned by imitation. He swears the goddess hid a secret recipe under the Tigris. People laugh softly, the sound like ripples in warm milk. In that moment, you feel history not as a timeline, but as a slow, sticky river of beer and clay flowing around your bare ankles. The night deepens. Crickets hiss in the reeds. Someone nearby drops a tablet, and it cracks like a brittle cookie. They sigh and start over. Another day's wages, another round of wedge marks. Above, the stars shimmer like tiny holes poked into a cosmic tablet, and you imagine some celestial scribe pressing styluses of light. You ease onward through the labyrinth of alleys until the city gives way to open fields. Out here, the air smells of damp barley and river silt, and the moon throws a silver glaze over everything. You're not just wandering, you're on the night shift of ancient accounting, tracing wedge-shaped marks in clay. Counting barley by moonlight feels like counting the stars themselves, except these stars pay workers and keep temples running. A low breeze flutters your linen tunic. Around you, farmers are still awake, hauling sacks of grain to communal storehouses. This is your mainstream historical fact tonight. The earliest written records from Mesopotamia are almost entirely about grain and beer rations. Not poetry, not prophecies, just who got how much and when. It's bureaucratic bedtime reading, but it built civilization's backbone. Your quirky tidbit? Some tablets actually include doodled footprints, thought to be literal signatures, pressed by workers' toes instead of a stylus. Historians still argue whether those prints were meant as authentication or just someone goofing off barefoot. A row of oil lamps lines the edge of a threshing floor. You hear a rhythmic scrape as men pull wooden sledges studded with flint across the grain to break the husks. Dust floats in the moonlight like ground cinnamon. Each time a load is measured, a scribe kneels, pushes a soft tablet onto a flat board, and carves the tiny triangles in groups of 10. The stylus taps sound like rain on a tin roof. You crouch beside one of the scribes. He's young, eyes ringed with exhaustion, but his hand moves in a hypnotic pattern. He whispers the numbers under his breath. Barley in, beer out, wages balanced. His teacher hovers nearby, correcting each wedge like a hawk watching fledglings. On the ground sits a clay cylinder seal with a lion motif. When rolled across a finished tablet, it leaves a raised relief, an ancient stamp of authenticity. Further down the line, women fill huge vats with malted grain and water. The beer is thick, almost porridge, and you're glad you're only smelling it and not drinking it. Donkeys bray at the scent. A sleepy dog paws at spilled barley. The moonlight glints off a pot of date syrup used to sweeten the brew. Mesopotamian beer's equivalent of a craft brew caramel stout. You can almost feel the temperature drop as clouds pass over the moon. The flicker of the lamps becomes a dance of light and shadow on the clay walls. Someone cracks a joke about barley angels stealing the foam while it ferments. Another mutters about a lost shipment to a temple upriver. This is your open scholarly debate phrase. Historians still argue whether these rations were wages or religious offerings disguised as wages. You wander between stacked jars. Their clay bellies are painted with simple symbols: triangles for beer, circles for oil, squares for grain. A frog croaks in a nearby irrigation canal. In the distance, you hear reed flutes again, a melody rising and falling like the tigress itself breathing in sleep. A group of children run past carrying tiny tablets like secret messages. They're scribal apprentices practicing numbers while racing each other. One trips, and the tablet leaves a clay smear on the packed earth. They laugh, scoop it up, and smooth it flat again, recycling homework the Mesopotamian way. Off to your left, the land slopes toward the river. Reed bundles lean against a mud wall, destined for tomorrow's boat construction. You can smell fish drying on racks, a tangy salt scent that mingles with sweet barley. Above, the stars seem closer now, as if you could press them into your own tablet. The night deepens and your eyelids grow heavy with the repetitive sound of stylus tapping, grain rustling, donkeys huffing, and water trickling. It's the soft percussion of a civilization counting itself alive. In this moonlit accounting yard, you sense how fragile and yet enduring this system is. Numbers etched into clay, barley measured out scoop by scoop, the future being shaped wedge by wedge. As you step back, your foot presses into a lump of discarded clay. You glance down and see your own heel mark. A quick, private joke flickers through your mind. In 4,000 years, some archaeologist will debate whether you were a worker or just a time-traveling tourist. You grin into the night and keep walking. The clay cool under your toes, the scribe's whispers fading like the echo of a dream. You slip along a narrow ramp leading up toward the temple district, where the mud brick lanes smell faintly of incense and old beer foam. The ziggurat rises before you, terraced like a giant stairway to the stars, each level lit by flickering torches. You duck under a low arch and step into a long hall where clay tablets are stacked in neat rows like loaves of bread waiting to bake. The night air cools as it flows through open windows carved high in the walls, carrying the scent of the Euphrates. Inside, you drift past columns coated with painted plaster. Priests in long robes shuffle silently between storerooms, tallying beer rations meant for temple workers. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Mesopotamian temples weren't just houses of worship. They were also economic centers, warehouses, banks, breweries, and sometimes the biggest employers in town. This is where offerings flowed in and paychecks, in the form of grain and beer, flowed out. Your quirky tidbit? Archaeologists have found tiny clay figurines of frogs and turtles tucked behind storage jars, possibly good luck charms to keep the beer from spoiling. Historians still argue whether these charms were religious offerings or simply ancient pest control mascots. You glide past a scribe bent over a tablet twice the usual size, lines of cuneiform marching like ant trails. He's muttering about a missing shipment of malted barley from upriver. In a corner, a priest chants softly to the goddess Ninkasi, who, legend claims, taught humanity how to brew beer. Someone spills a ladle of liquid on the floor, and the smell of fermenting grain wafts up, sweet and slightly sour. The torchlight glitters on a row of clay jars sealed with bitumen. You run your fingers over the warm, sticky surface, feeling tiny cracks where the sealant's cooling. The jars are stamped with reed marks identifying the temple wing and the worker crew assigned to it. Your footsteps echo softly, and a bat flits overhead like a moving ink blot. Deeper inside, the temple vault opens into a high-ceilinged room with a stone basin sunk into the floor. The basin holds cool water from the canal, reflecting torchlight like liquid bronze. A priest drops a pinch of barley into it, murmuring a blessing, then consults a tablet as if cross-checking with the gods. The scene feels both corporate and mystical, a boardroom meeting with divinity. You pass shelves of clay tags tied with string to bundles of reeds. Some are tokens of beer credits owed to workers. Others track the flow of ingredients between temple kitchens. One tablet you glimpse lists 2 jars for singers at dawn, 1 jar for the reed flute player, proof that even musicians were paid in beer. A donkey sighs somewhere outside, and the sound seeps through like a yawn of the night itself. Your sandals scuff a floor mosaic of baked clay tiles. As you walk, you overhear 2 priests whispering about a recent omen, a strange alignment of Venus and the moon. They wonder if it means the river will flood early, and whether to increase or cut beer rations. You think of the debate you overheard earlier, wages or offerings. Historians still argue whether the temple's beer output was truly for workers or for keeping the gods tipsy enough to smile on the city. In a back alcove, you find a niche lined with clay tablets arranged by year and month, the world's first filing cabinet. A faint draft slips through a crack, stirring dust and the smell of old ink. You imagine the countless fingers that have pressed styluses here, each wedge an echo of someone's breath. The walls seem to hum with quiet life, the soft crack of cooling clay, the drip of water in the basin, a muffled cough from a scribe. Your eyes grow heavy under the torchlight. Above you, a mural depicts a goddess holding a reed stylus like a magic wand, touching clay to bring order from chaos. It's almost comforting, as if the universe itself runs on tidy ledgers and measured scoops of beer. As you leave the hall, the night wind brushes your face, carrying the scent of barley mash and the hush of the sleeping city. The ziggurat stairs descend ahead, a steady slope of shadow and clay. Behind you, the priests continue their quiet arithmetic with the gods, tallying beer in the ledger of eternity. You descend the ziggurat steps and follow a side path lined with palm trunks until the ground levels into the scribal quarter. Here the city exhales. No temple chants, no priests. Just the scratching hush of styluses and the faint smell of wet clay. The houses are low, their roofs patched with reed mats, and every doorway spills a golden wedge of lamplight onto the street. This is where the bureaucrats of beer live, and tonight you're slipping among them like a ghost with ink on its hands. Through one open window, you see 3 young scribes sitting cross-legged at low wooden desks. Each desk is scattered with clay lumps wrapped in damp cloth to keep them soft. The styluses look like tiny chopsticks with triangular tips. You lean closer and hear one whisper his multiplication tables. 4 jugs, 2 workers, 8 jugs. Like a mantra. This is your mainstream historical fact tonight. Scribal schools in Mesopotamia drilled students relentlessly, teaching not just writing, but math, law, and the complex measurements that underpinned rationing. On another desk sits a half-finished tablet covered in tiny wedge marks, but also a doodle of a donkey wearing a crown. That's your quirky tidbit. Archaeologists have actually found cuneiform tablets with jokes and crude sketches mixed in with serious records, as if some apprentice couldn't resist adding a punchline to a tax form. Historians still argue whether these were tolerated acts of humor or punishable scribal pranks. The lamplight flickers. You watch one scribe dip a reed into a bowl of water and brush it lightly over a drying tablet to keep it from cracking. He sighs and mutters about the governor's missing beer jars, the same rumor you heard back in the storerooms. Another scribe shuffles a stack of older tablets, squinting at faded impressions like someone checking last week's receipts. Outside, a donkey snorts. Someone's cooking lentils, and the earthy smell sneaks in through the window. You feel your own stomach growl. In the courtyard, a group of apprentice scribes practice rolling cylinder seals across damp clay, producing long, repeating patterns of lions, goats, and fish. The seals leave such clean impressions they look like barcodes from a grocery store. Except, instead of scanning at checkout, they're rolled onto beer rations. One of the boys pauses, wiping sweat from his forehead, and asks in a low voice whether the goddess of writing will ever forgive a crooked wedge. His teacher chuckles and says the goddess loves neatness, not perfection. You smile at the timelessness of it. Even 4,000 years ago, students worried about grades. Past the courtyard, a narrow lane leads to a community kiln. You peek inside and see rows of tablets propped like cookies on racks, the heat baking them from soft gray to hard tan. The air shimmers and smells faintly metallic, like wet earth turning to stone. A master scribe leans on a staff, watching the fire with half-closed eyes. He claims you can hear the future in the crackling if you listen carefully. Nearby, someone hums a tune about a crocodile stealing a priest's sandals, a callback to an earlier joke you overheard. The sound drifts across the lane and makes the night feel smaller, cozier. You step around a sleeping dog curled under a reed mat, the clay cool under your bare toes. Above you, the stars form their slow script, constellations as wedges of light. You imagine each one a sign pressed into the sky by some cosmic stylus. Down here on Earth, your eyes grow heavy with the repetitive sounds, the soft press of stylus into clay, the squeak of reed mats shifting in the breeze, the occasional mutter of arithmetic. You pass a doorway where an older scribe is tutoring a child on fractions of beer, 2/3 of a jar, 3/4 of a scoop. He draws a small diagram of a jar sliced into sections, an ancient pie chart on clay. The child stifles a yawn. You feel one rising in yourself. As you drift toward the far end of the quarter, you sense the weight of thousands of tablets piled in dark rooms, each one a moment of daily life pressed into earth. And through it all runs the steady flow of beer, grain, and human effort, weaving a civilization together wedge by wedge. You leave the scribal quarter behind, crossing a low mud wall and stepping onto the riverbank where the Euphrates glides like melted bronze under the moon. The air is thicker here, heavy with damp reeds and the sweet, sour smell of fermenting grain. You follow a narrow plank walkway to a dock crowded with reed boats tied by twisted ropes. Each boat rocks gently, its hull stuffed with clay jars sealed tight with bitumen. The night is alive with creaks, sloshes, and distant croaks, like a lullaby of water and clay. This is your mainstream historical fact tonight. Mesopotamia's rivers were the highways of their world. Bulk goods, grain, oil, and especially beer, moved by boat, not cart. Land routes were slow and expensive, but the rivers carried entire storehouses at once. Your quirky tidbit: some surviving tablets list boat beer separate from land beer, as if river transport deserved its own brand. Historians still argue whether this was a quality difference or just an administrative quirk. You step aboard one of the reed boats, its deck soft under your sandals, and feel the gentle sway. A boatman squints at you from under a reed hat, muttering about crocodiles and river spirits. He gestures to an amulet hanging from the mast, a tiny clay frog. You recall seeing similar charms back in the temple, tucked near the beer jars. The boat's cargo holds are stacked with amphorae marked with little triangles for beer and squiggly lines for the destination city. The boat pushes off with a shove of a pole, gliding silently into the current. The moonlight lays a path on the water. You lean over the side, watching reeds drift past and fish dart under the surface like tiny arrows. The smell of wet clay mingles with the warm scent of date syrup seeping from a cracked jar. You pass other boats in the dark, some laden with grain sacks, others with livestock. A donkey brays from a nearby barge, its echo bouncing off the riverbanks. Further along, a barge of temple musicians plucks lutes and flutes, their melody rising and falling like a sleepy tide. A man on deck recites a tally. 12 jars in, 12 jars out, 12 jars in, a rhythmic mantra of accounting that blends with the river's hush. You pause by the mast where a clay tablet is lashed with rope, recording the cargo's details, like an ancient shipping label. A small cylinder seal hangs from the same rope, ready to stamp receipts on arrival. A boy apprentice tries to mimic the boatman's knot, fumbling in the dark. Someone jokes about how even the gods can't untangle a bad sailor's knot. The crew laughs softly, like water on stone. The current carries you past patches of marsh where the air turns cool and smells faintly of mint. Fireflies blink along the banks, and you imagine them as tiny styluses pressing sparks into the night. The boatman spits into the river and mutters a blessing against capsizing. You glance at a dark ripple trailing alongside. Could be just a log, could be a crocodile testing the hull. Further downstream, you pass a watchtower where 2 guards lean on spears. They call out, asking the boat's origin. The boatman holds up the clay tablet and the seal, proof of official cargo. You feel like you're on the world's oldest FedEx route. Historians still argue whether these river inspections were for security, taxes, or ritual purity. The river widens, and a cool breeze sweeps across the deck. You smell rain in the distance. Overhead, stars blur into streaks as the boat glides on. You rest your hands on a warm jar of beer and feel the faint vibration of liquid sloshing inside. The rhythmic push of the current begins to lull you, each ripple a soft drumbeat under your ribs. The boy apprentice yawns and leans against a bundle of reeds. The boatman hums a tune about the goddess who taught men to steer by the stars. You look up, tracing the constellation they call the fish, then the lion, then the scribe's stylus. You imagine each wedge of light an entry on some cosmic ledger. As the night deepens, the city's glow fades behind you, replaced by open marshland dotted with distant fires. A heron lifts off the bank, its wings a silent arc over the water. The reed boat slides on, carrying its jars of beer and your drifting thoughts toward the next unseen port, while the Euphrates whispers its ancient arithmetic all around. The river narrows and bends, and the reed boat nudges against a small jetty half hidden by date palms. Lanterns sway in the breeze, casting rings of light over packed earth. You step off, following a winding path toward a cluster of low mounds rising out of the sand. This is no market or temple. This is a necropolis. Tonight you're stepping into the cool hush of burial chambers, where the dead lie with jars of beer at their feet, sleeping off eternity. A dry wind pushes at your tunic as you duck into a doorway carved with crescent symbols. Inside, the air drops several degrees, smelling of clay, bitumen, and something faintly sweet. Date beer, sealed long ago. This is your mainstream historical fact tonight. Many Mesopotamian burials contained beer jars, both as offerings to gods and as provisions for the deceased in the afterlife. Beer wasn't just sustenance, it was spiritual insurance. Your quirky tidbit? In a few tombs, archaeologists found clay straws tall enough to sip beer from communal vats, suggesting the dead might share a cosmic drink together. Historians still argue whether these long straws were symbolic or genuinely used at funerary feasts before burial. The corridor opens into a round chamber lit by a single oil lamp flickering like a shy star. Along the walls sit rows of squat jars sealed with mud caps. Some are painted with reeds, others with crescent moons. The lids crack slightly under your touch, but hold firm. You imagine the frothy beer inside turning thick and dark like molasses, the last bubbles long gone. A priest kneels near the far wall, murmuring a low chant. He sprinkles barley grains onto the floor and pours a thin line of beer as an offering, the liquid vanishing into the thirsty earth. His stylus rests nearby, a reminder that even here, in death's cool shadow, the paperwork never ends. A tablet lies on a stone bench, listing names of the buried and the jars allotted to each. Your sandals scuff over a mosaic of black and white stones. The pattern depicts two figures, one holding a stylus, the other a large jar. The caption reads, if you can believe your sleepy eyes, provisioner to the gods. You wonder who commissioned such a self-aware memorial. In a small alcove, clay figurines of frogs, goats, and lions perch like guardians. One frog has a wedge carved into its back, a tally mark, or perhaps a joke. You think back to the temple storerooms, the frog charms, the frog on the boat mast. This motif ripples through the culture like a watermark, blending economy and superstition. You trail your hand along the wall, feeling the indentations where workers pressed their palms centuries ago. The coolness seeps into your fingertips, making you drowsy. In the silence, the drip of condensation from the ceiling sounds like distant stylus taps. Beyond another doorway, you find a larger chamber, its ceiling propped with timber beams blackened by age. Here, the offerings are more elaborate: carved cups, woven reed mats, little clay plaques describing who gave what. One plaque records 2 jars beer, 1 jar oil, 1 sheep, the original grocery receipt for the dead. A low chuckle from the priest echoes softly when he notices your fascination. He explains, half joking, that the gods keep their own ledgers in the sky, balancing lives like accounts. You glance upward at the faintly painted stars on the ceiling and imagine them as cuneiform dots. Historians still argue whether these painted ceilings were merely decorative or coded with astronomical meaning. A gust of night air sneaks down the corridor, stirring the lamp's flame. Shadows leap across the jars like dancers. You picture the deceased reaching for their clay mugs in some quiet afterworld tavern, sipping slowly while scribes tally their cosmic credits. As you leave the burial chambers, the warm night air hits your face like a gentle wave. You walk back toward the river, your sandals crunching over gravel. The scent of date palms returns, along with the distant sound of a reed flute. Always a reed flute in this world, threading through beer and clay like a soundtrack to civilization. The boat still waits at the jetty, its frog amulet swaying from the mast. You step aboard, the deck rocking under your weight. In the east, a pale stripe of dawn glows faintly above the horizon, promising a new day of ledgers, barley, and quiet devotion to the gods of beer. You push off from the jetty as the first hints of dawn streak the sky in soft apricot and gray. The Euphrates glistens like liquid bronze in the morning light, and you can see merchants already arranging baskets along the riverbank. Your feet sway gently with the boat's rhythm, and a faint tang of fermenting barley drifts up from the jars stacked around you. Today, you find yourself under the gaze of Hammurabi himself, or at least his laws etched in stone, reminding everyone exactly how to handle beer. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Hammurabi's code, carved in diorite, contains specific regulations for taverns, brewers, and beer prices, making this arguably the earliest example of government oversight in alcohol. A tavern owner caught watering down ale could face steep fines, or worse. Your quirky tidbit? Some scribes secretly slipped humor into these tablets, like noting, "If beer is too weak, the gods shall frown," hinting that divine approval was as important as legal compliance. Historians still argue whether such notes were intentional commentary or simple clerical flair. The boat nudges against the bank, and you climb out to find yourself beneath a stone pillar engraved with the famous stele. Its dark surface gleams faintly in the morning light. You trace your fingers over the carved figures, Hammurabi raising his hand to receive authority from Shamash, the sun god. Behind the formal imagery, tiny symbols mark laws about beer jars and tavern rules. Nearby, merchants set out small clay jugs, lining them like soldiers in formation. One man taps a reed stylus against a jar to tally morning sales, while another grumbles about a rival brewer upriver. You inhale the warm scent of fresh barley porridge, mingled with fermented ale. A boy runs past, carrying a tiny clay tablet, announcing the number of jars delivered to a temple. You wander into the alley behind the stele and peek into a tavern courtyard. Early risers sweep dust from the floor, while apprentices stir vats of mash. A woman slips a note under a clay lid, perhaps a secret recipe or a list of patrons. Your eye catches a small carved cup tucked beneath a table, etched with a tiny smiling face. Someone, centuries ago, had a sense of humor even under Hammurabi's stern rules. Across the courtyard, a donkey brays, startled by a sudden clatter of clay jars. The sound echoes off the mud brick walls, blending with the low hum of conversation and the rhythmic stir of grain. You step closer to a tall tablet listing tavern fines and notices of complaint. The scribes have done their best to keep everything in order, though the occasional smudged wedge and doodle of a fish hints at the limits of bureaucracy. A priest passes by, blessing a batch of ale destined for temple workers. He pauses to consult a tablet and nods at a scribe, who adjusts the tally. You think about how precise this system had to be. Enough beer for the living, enough offerings for the dead, enough ink to satisfy both gods and governors. Historians still argue whether these meticulous regulations were primarily economic or more a moral and social tool to keep citizens in line. You wander back toward the main street, passing merchants unloading jars for the day. A small child balances a tray of date cakes, and the scent mingles with malted barley in the cool morning air. You catch a whisper of laughter as a scribe nudges a friend, recalling a story about watered-down beer at last week's temple feast. It's a reminder that, even under Hammurabi's strict eye, human quirks and jokes survive. The day brightens fully now, and the river sparkles like a ribbon of molten gold. You pause to watch a boat float past, stacked high with amphorae, their clay surfaces reflecting light like tiny suns. Somewhere, a reed flute begins its morning song. You take a deep breath, the aroma of barley, river, and dust filling your senses. You realize the world is alive in numbers, laws, and laughter, all flowing together as predictably and unpredictably as the Euphrates itself. The morning sun climbs higher, spilling warm light over the palace courtyards where queens and elite women oversee the daily rhythm of brewing. You step quietly along the edge of a courtyard where large clay vats bubble with frothy beer. The sweet tang of malt and date syrup thicken the air. This is no ordinary kitchen. It's a hub of strategy, gossip, and the subtle politics of who controls the best brew. Your mainstream historical fact. Mesopotamian palaces often had dedicated brewing facilities run by women of high status, who managed both production and distribution of beer to temple workers, soldiers, and visiting dignitaries. Your quirky tidbit? Some elite women were known to hide secret recipes on tiny clay slips, slipped under larger tablets, almost like ancient espionage, but for ale. Historians still argue whether these secret slips influenced official brewing practices or were merely personal pride projects. You lean against a column as a young apprentice pours a fresh batch of beer into amphorae. The sticky mixture drips down the side of a vat, and you can see traces of the froth still clinging to the edge. A bird squawks overhead, startled by the aroma. You notice one of the queens sipping from a small cup, her eyes scanning tablets that list daily rations for the palace staff. She jots a note, perhaps adjusting quantities or adding a ceremonial pour for a visiting priest. In another courtyard, musicians tune reeds and lutes, preparing for a small celebration. A scribe counts jars and marks the ledger meticulously, ensuring every worker receives their share. You see a pair of apprentices playfully rolling cylinder seals across damp clay, leaving repeating impressions of lions and goats. One accidentally presses it onto a jar lid, creating a decorative, if unofficial, seal. The sun climbs higher, and the scent of warm barley fills your lungs. You step into a shadowed corridor where jars line both sides like soldiers. Each jar carries tiny inscriptions: the intended recipient, the date, the quantity. One jar bears a faint doodle of a smiling sun. a reminder that humor threaded even through official distributions. You chuckle softly, recalling the frog charm on the boat and the doodled donkey in the scribal quarter. Mesopotamians clearly had a taste for whimsy. A queen appears, her robe brushing the floor, observing the apprentices as they measure and stir. She laughs softly at a boy who miscounted his barley scoops. "Accuracy matters," she whispers, echoing through the courtyard like a soft decree. Nearby, a priest blesses a vat with a sprinkle of water, invoking Ninkasi, the goddess of beer. You wander to a side chamber where a hidden tablet lies beneath a stack of larger records. It contains a subtle tweak to the brewing recipe: more water, less date syrup. Perhaps an experiment in taste. You smile at the thought of history's first quality control department operating in silence, centuries before modern labs. Historians still argue whether such tweaks were intended for palace consumption only, or if they influenced temple distributions as well. A warm breeze drifts in, carrying the scent of drying reed mats and the faint sound of a donkey braying beyond the walls. The palace hums with the rhythm of measured scoops, whispered advice, and careful record-keeping. Every jar represents labor, calculation, and a subtle exercise of power. You pause in the courtyard, the light catching dust motes like tiny stars. The aroma of freshly brewed beer, sweet and heady, mingles with the faint tang of clay and sun-warmed earth. A scribe hums a tune about the river and the goddess who taught mortals to brew, and you realize that even in the order of bureaucracy, joy and mischief float like froth atop every jar. You leave the palace courtyards behind, following a narrow, sandy path toward the bustling marketplace where merchants, priests, and townsfolk mingle beneath the high sun. The air is thick with the scent of barley, dates, and fresh clay. You pass stalls stacked with jars of beer, each labeled with a careful cuneiform tally. Traders huddle over their wares, discussing prices and delivery schedules in low, urgent voices. Here's your mainstream historical fact tonight. Mesopotamian merchants often relied on precise ledgers to track trade, especially in beer and grain, and these records were sometimes kept under the supervision of lunar priests to ensure fairness. Your quirky tidbit? In a few excavated tablets, merchants recorded minor superstitions alongside their accounts, like noting that a shipment was safe because a moonbeam had struck the jar. Historians still argue whether such notes were serious ritual or just playful scribal doodles. You wander past a stall where jars of beer are arranged on reed mats. A lunar priest hovers nearby, adjusting the calendar to match the latest moon cycle, ensuring the ration schedule aligns with sacred observances. A child tugs at your sleeve, offering a small clay cup to taste a sample. You take it gingerly. The brew is thick, foamy, and faintly sweet. The flavor lingers on your tongue like a memory pressed into clay. A merchant shuffles papers and murmurs numbers under his breath. How many jars went to the temple? How many to the palace? How many to the canals? You notice tiny doodles in the margins. Fish, birds, stars. Little visual mnemonics to remember complex trade routes. One scribal apprentice sneaks a cylinder seal across a tablet, leaving a row of repeating lions and goats. The pattern is perfect, almost hypnotic, like ancient barcodes on beer jars. You pause near a fountain where water runs over smooth stones. A scribe dips a small tablet into the water to soften the clay, preparing it for the next batch of records. Someone cracks a joke about a frog stealing barley from a crate. The same motif you've seen everywhere tonight. A cultural running gag. Your eyes drift to the horizon where reed boats line the river like a fleet of floating warehouses, ready to ferry beer to the next town. Overhead, a lunar priest points to the crescent moon and mutters a calculation, adjusting festival dates. The rhythm of trade, religion, and astronomy flows together like a river, each influencing the other in subtle ways. Historians still argue whether such lunar adjustments were primarily for agricultural efficiency or more symbolic ritual purposes. You wander deeper into the market. Musicians play soft tunes on reed flutes while merchants tally sales, blending commerce and culture seamlessly. A cat slinks between jars, sniffing for spilled grain. You notice a young apprentice copying notes from one tablet to another, correcting mistakes with tiny stylus taps. The diligence is hypnotic, almost soothing, like watching waves lap the shore of the Euphrates. You pause at a small shrine tucked between two stalls. A tiny clay figure of the moon god stands beside a stack of beer jars. Traders whisper brief prayers for safe passage of their shipments and good returns. You catch a faint scent of incense mixed with fermenting barley, the combination almost intoxicating. As the sun climbs higher, you feel a lazy drowsiness settle in. The marketplace hums around you, merchants shouting, flutes playing, water trickling, jars clinking. But beneath it all is the pulse of careful record-keeping, of ledgers and tablets and meticulous attention to every jar. You lean against a post, imagining all the unseen hands tallying, recording, and adjusting, their efforts as invisible yet essential as the river itself. You leave the busy market behind and follow a narrow, winding alley toward the outskirts of the city, where mud brick warehouses cluster like sleepy giants. The air is cooler here, scented with wet clay and the faint tang of fermenting barley. You tread softly over scattered potsherds, trying not to wake the dozing guards or the cats curled atop the jars. Everything feels ancient and alive at once, like a dream pressed into clay. Here's your mainstream historical fact. These warehouses were critical hubs for storing rations of beer and grain for workers, soldiers, and priests alike, and they were often managed by scribes who lived nearby to ensure daily tallies were accurate. Your quirky tidbit? Archaeologists have uncovered secret notes tucked into jars, sometimes jokes, sometimes doodles of animals, that suggest even in the most serious accounting, someone wanted to leave a little humanity behind. Historians still argue whether these hidden messages were tolerated, ignored, or secretly celebrated. You wander past stacks of amphorae, each sealed carefully and stamped with cylinder seals. The rhythmic clink of jars as workers move them is almost hypnotic. A faint breeze lifts the scent of sweet malted barley, drifting over the packed earth and into your senses. Somewhere, a child practices tally marks on a scrap of clay, murmuring numbers under his breath. A small group of apprentices carries new shipments from a nearby dock. Each jar is meticulously recorded on clay tablets before being stacked. One apprentice accidentally knocks over a jar, and the soft thud echoes through the warehouse. A donkey brays in the distance, adding a sleepy percussion to the scene. The scribe supervising the operation chuckles, scribbling a note about overexcited. You step into a shadowed corner where older tablets are stacked like fragile bricks. The inscriptions are worn, but you can make out lists of barley, beer, and even small rations of date syrup for temple singers. Someone has drawn tiny symbols in the margins: frogs, fish, stars, callbacks to motifs you've seen in temples, markets, and palaces. It's a culture threading humor and superstition into bureaucracy. A breeze drifts through open windows, carrying the distant scent of river water and reeds. You watch as a priest sprinkles barley grains over the floor in a quiet ritual, muttering words in Sumerian that might be a blessing or simply a habit. Nearby, an apprentice rolls a cylinder seal over a soft tablet, leaving repeating patterns of lions and goats. The click of the seal, the soft scratch of stylus on clay, and the whisper of barley on the floor combine into a gentle rhythm that lulls your senses. You wander past a corner where a tablet lists beer rations for workers digging irrigation canals. A woman sweeps nearby, muttering about missing jars. You imagine the discussion that might follow. Who drank the extra jar? Probably the apprentice again. A small laugh escapes you. These scenes are timeless, echoes of office gossip translated into clay. As the sun sets in your imagination, the warehouse grows quiet. The jars sit in neat rows, the apprentices rest their heads on low tables, and the scribes close their ledgers. You feel a wave of calm, the pulse of civilization measured in barley, beer, and tiny wedge marks on clay. You lean against a stack of amphorae, the cool mud brick beneath your fingers, and let the soft sounds of the warehouse, clinking jars, distant donkeys, a low reed flute, fade into your mind. Even in the bustle, there is rhythm, order, and the quiet satisfaction of a day's work carefully recorded. You leave the warehouses behind, stepping onto a stretch of open farmland dotted with irrigation canals glinting in the soft morning light. The air is cool, carrying the scent of wet soil, sprouting barley, and a faint sweetness of fermenting grain from distant village breweries. You trudge along a narrow levee, careful not to disturb the irrigation channels, which gurgle like sleepy rivers, each one delivering life to the fields in measured doses. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Mesopotamians engineered an intricate network of canals, dikes, and reservoirs, allowing them to grow barley and other crops reliably, barley being the key ingredient in beer, which served as both sustenance and currency. Your quirky tidbit? Some tablets mention beer for the river spirits, poured directly into irrigation channels, possibly to keep the waterways cooperative. Historians still argue whether these offerings were ritualistic superstition or practical encouragement for smooth irrigation. You pass a group of farmers leveling the soil, their wooden plows scraping through mud. Each scoop of earth is measured with precision. The scribes' tablets keep count of how much barley is planted, how much is harvested, and how much will go to breweries. You watch one farmer dip a handful of grain into his palm, inspecting it under sunlight, as if reading its destiny. Along the canal, women stir large vats of barley mash. A thin line of froth bubbles along the edge. The scent is intoxicating in a gentle, earthy way. A child runs past, balancing a small clay jar, spilling a little onto the path, and you smile at the chaos of life blending with meticulous order. In the background, a reed flute plays a lazy tune, threading through the rhythmic clatter of wooden wheels and plodding donkeys. A scribe crouches at the canal edge, stylus in hand, marking small wedges on a clay tablet. He counts workers, rations, and beer jars distributed for labor. One wedge is smudged, and he murmurs a quiet curse, more to the clay than anyone else. Nearby, an apprentice presses a tiny frog charm against a damp tablet, echoing the charms you've seen throughout the city. The sun climbs higher, warming your shoulders. You see another canal fork, where a small bridge carries a caravan of clay jars. The jars are carefully labeled Temple, Palace, Market, each with wedge marks and a cylinder seal imprint. You realize the precision is staggering, a system of checks and balances built long before spreadsheets. Historians still argue whether such detailed record-keeping was primarily about resource management or maintaining social hierarchy. A donkey brays. Someone spills barley, sending a cloud of dust into the sunlight. You inhale deeply, savoring the earthy smell. Farther down the levee, a priest pours a small jar of beer into the canal, whispering to the river spirits. You smile at the continuity. From temple to marketplace to river, beer flows through every level of life, sacred and mundane alike. You sit on the edge of a small embankment, letting the gentle hum of the fields wash over you. The soft scratch of styluses on clay, the distant laughter of children, the low groan of oxen pulling plows. The rhythm is hypnotic. You feel the pulse of civilization in barley, beer, and careful measurement, a heartbeat that spans millennia. A warm breeze lifts dust motes into the sunlight, which glimmer like tiny stars above the irrigated fields. Somewhere, a scribe hums a tune about the goddess of brewing, her voice faint but steady. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the subtle music of the fields and the soft scent of barley carry you closer to sleep. You wander past the irrigated fields toward a cluster of village homes, low and rectangular with roofs patched in reeds and mud. Smoke curls from small hearths, carrying the faint sweetness of cooking barley and the tang of fermenting beer. Chickens cluck in the yard. A donkey chews lazily on a bundle of straw, and children chase one another while balancing tiny clay cups. The air is alive with the soft, domestic pulse of everyday life. Here's your mainstream historical fact. Villages in Mesopotamia were organized around both communal and private brewing, with households producing beer for family consumption, temple offerings, and small trade. Your quirky tidbit? Some tablets record playful competitions, like who could brew the frothiest beer, complete with exaggerated praise for jars that bubbled like the Euphrates in flood. Historians still argue whether these contests were truly recreational or had social and religious significance. You slip into a shaded courtyard where women stir vats of barley mash while a man scribes tallies on a clay tablet. The aroma of fermenting grain is thick and heady. A small frog hops across a pile of crushed barley, prompting a child to giggle and attempt to sketch it on a clay scrap. It's a quiet echo of the temple charms and market doodles you've seen earlier, a thread of humor weaving through the practical. The man recording rations counts carefully. 3 jars to the temple singer, 1 jar to the water carrier, 2 jars to the scribe's apprentice. Each entry is precise, the wedge marks sharp and methodical. Outside, a woman pours a ladle of beer into a shallow bowl for a household offering. The mix of work, devotion, and daily ritual feels almost meditative. You wander down a narrow path toward a small communal brewing area. Vats line the earthen floor, and apprentices carry jars between them with soft, careful steps. One jar slips and tips slightly, a faint splash echoing off the walls. A laugh ripples from the corner. The incident is noted on a nearby clay tablet with a tiny smiling doodle recording the event for posterity. Nearby, a scribe rolls a cylinder seal across a soft tablet, leaving patterns of lions, fish, and goats, a rhythm that seems to sync with the distant cluck of chickens and low braying of donkeys. You notice how every aspect of life, labor, trade, devotion, humor, is tracked, measured, and preserved in clay. Historians still argue whether this obsession with record-keeping was more about efficiency, control, or simply pride in meticulous work. A breeze stirs, lifting the scent of roasting grain and sweet malt, blending with the warm earth. Children chase shadows, dogs bark, and the river hums faintly in the distance. You trace the path of jars being carried, tallying, and poured into vats, imagining the hands that guided each one, each wedge pressed like a heartbeat into history. The village feels timeless. You pause in the courtyard, inhaling the mingling aromas of barley, mud, and a faint tang of fermenting beer. A small flame flickers in a hearth, reflecting off clay walls, creating a dance of light and shadow. You notice a tiny clay figurine of a frog tucked into a corner, echoing every charm, doodle, and talisman you've passed tonight. You settle against a warm wall, letting the gentle noises, chickens, children, dripping water, the soft hiss of fermentation, lull your mind. The village breathes around you, a living testament to human care, labor, and a peculiar devotion to beer, all pressed into clay ledgers, jars, and memories. You wander away from the village toward the horizon, where distant dunes meet a pale sky, the air shimmering in heat waves that blur river and earth into a single golden ribbon. The scent of barley, clay, and fermented beer drifts faintly from the villages and fields you've passed, mingling with dry sand and the faint tang of reed mats left in the sun. The world stretches wide and slow, a rhythm of labor, measurement, and quiet devotion that feels almost hypnotic in the haze. Here's your mainstream historical fact. By the late 3rd millennium BCE, Mesopotamians had developed elaborate trade networks stretching across cities and even regions, moving beer, grain, and clay products across hundreds of miles. Your quirky tidbit? Merchants occasionally included small good luck charms in shipments, like clay frogs or tiny clay animals, to ensure safe travel. Tiny superstitions traveling alongside massive economic networks. Historians still argue whether these charms were seriously believed in or merely cultural tokens of goodwill. You trace the edge of a canal that winds lazily through the sand, reflecting the shimmering heat like molten glass. A reed boat drifts slowly past, jars stacked neatly, a frog amulet swaying on the mast. You imagine the river as a conveyor belt of civilization, carrying barley, beer, and human effort, its currents uniting towns, palaces, and temples in one slow, continuous rhythm. A shepherd pauses on a distant mound, his clay jar balanced beside him, watching over grazing goats. You hear the faint echo of a flute from the village behind you, mingling with the murmur of water and the whispering of the wind through reeds. A soft clatter signals a jar tipped over somewhere along the canal, and you chuckle quietly. It seems even millennia ago, accidents and minor mishaps kept life interesting. You bend to inspect the sand, noticing tiny imprints, footprints of humans, donkeys, and birds interwoven with shallow wedge marks pressed from forgotten tablets. It's as though the earth itself has absorbed the patterns of record-keeping, trade, and devotion, leaving faint echoes of lives that measured, brewed, and accounted their way through history. Further along, you pause beside a small mound where broken clay jars and fragments of tablets peek through the sand. Each shard hints at stories of daily life, beer rations tallied for workers, offerings to temple singers, doodles etched into the margins by bored apprentices. The whimsical frogs, smiling suns, and tiny lions seem to wink at you across centuries, a reminder that humor and humanity threaded through even the most meticulous bureaucracy. The sun climbs higher, painting the dunes gold and orange, and a warm breeze stirs the reeds along the canal. You inhale deeply, tasting the faint sweetness of barley carried on the wind. The river hums, carrying its cargo of civilization forward, endless and patient. The distant hum of a village flute, the soft clinking of clay jars, the low bray of a donkey, all coalesce into a gentle symphony. As you sit on the sand, the slow, deliberate pulse of Mesopotamian life settles over you. Records, jars, trade, and rituals form an invisible tapestry connecting temples, palaces, scribes, and farmers. You feel the rhythm of thousands of lives, measured in wedges pressed into clay, moving like ripples across the surface of history. A single reed bends near your hand, whispering in the breeze. Somewhere, a scribe hums the tune of brewing, a tiny human thread in the vast fabric of civilization. You close your eyes, letting the heat, scent, and subtle noises of the ancient world lull you into the soft twilight between wakefulness and dreams. Now, let your breathing slow, matching the gentle sway of rivers and the quiet hum of villages you've passed. Imagine the clay jars resting in their neat rows, the tablets etched with wedge marks, each a story pressed into earth for thousands of years. Feel the warmth of the sun on mud brick walls, the subtle aroma of barley and date syrup lingering in the air. The distant sound of reed flutes blends with the low whisper of wind through reeds, softening your senses and easing your mind. Visualize the scribes leaning over their clay, counting beer jars, recording rations, sometimes doodling frogs and smiling suns, little whispers of humanity that have traveled centuries to reach you. Hear the faint bray of a donkey, the soft clatter of jars, the laughter of children chasing shadows, threads of ordinary life forming a delicate tapestry of sound. Let the gentle rhythm of counting, pouring, and recording carry you, one wedge mark at a time, into the slow current of memory and imagination. The villages, the palaces, the temples, and the warehouses fade softly, leaving only the warm earth beneath your fingertips and the quiet pulse of civilization flowing around you. Each scent, each sound, each small act of brewing or counting merges into a soothing pattern, a lullaby written in clay and barley. Allow yourself to drift alongside it, knowing that the world you've wandered tonight has measured, brewed, and recorded its way across millennia, patiently, meticulously, and with a touch of humor. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let the warmth, rhythm, and faint aroma of ancient Mesopotamia carry you into sleep, as gentle and enduring as the river itself. Sweet dreams.